So, this is the executive summary of the talk. I was really quite innocent until the age of 11 when I discovered computers. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. Spent about 20 years as pretty much a full-time APLer, although towards the end of that time I got seduced by the world of objects, became addicted to them. I'm now in recovery. Okay, although I have to admit, occasionally I lapse and create the occasional class. But hey, that's... So if you saw the talk on ANNs, you'll remember that the thing that kindled my interest in robotics and AI was that there was a terrific buzz about robots in 1956 when Forbidden Planet came out. But I had to wait for a couple more years before I actually got to see, and a little later, to program a computer. And the first computer that I ever saw at the Business Efficiency Exhibition, which was the first one in the UK to have computers in it, was a thing called the Ferranti Pegasus. A very powerful machine. It had 64 words of high-speed memory. It had a huge 4K drum, and it could do about 10,000 calculations a second. So it was a serial computer built on what the English call valves and the Americans call vacuum tubes. And one of the joys of working with it, which I discovered later, was that every morning the engineers would come in before anyone started work. They would open the cabinets. They would run a screwdriver along the cabinets to shake all the valves so that if the filament of the valve was going to fail, it failed in enough time for them to change them before the first users turned up. Of course, Bob told me that this was just a sign of how backward the English were, because what everybody else did was they left the computer on 24 hours a day, which materially lengthened the life of the valves, but we were too dumb to do that. So I saw this, and I just knew it's what I wanted to do. And luckily, after I'd started buying all the books I could on computing, a colleague of my mother's said, "Oh, I'm using a Pegasus to try and do some timetabling. Would Romilly like to write a program?" And he lent me a Pegasus autocode manual, and there is not quite the first program I ever wrote. Not quite, because the first program I wrote had a bug in it. And he fixed it for me, and you'll have to wait until 2014 to find out what happened to the program eventually. But what that's doing in this rather strange minimalist language called Pegasus autocode is it's calculating E. There's actually a perfectly good way of doing that, but I wanted to do it by hand just to show that I could. The other thing that's slightly... No, there's a laser pointer if I press that. Yeah. That's the correct symbol from the character set. The way that you did branching in Pegasus autocode was you specified a line number, which could be a variable, and you used a right-pointing arrow to switch control to that. So I don't know if Ken got the idea from there, but certainly it was around for a while before APL implementations adopted that trick. And I thoroughly enjoyed it, but of course opportunities to actually program computers were fairly thin on the ground in those days, and I had to wait until the year between finishing school and going on to college at Cambridge before I got a chance to do some serious programming again. And my father was an academic. He was, at that stage, dean of the faculty at the college where he worked. And somebody had come up with an absolutely mad scheme for changing the way that exam grades were marked and classified, which he was absolutely certain was going to lead to disaster. And he couldn't persuade them. And in the end, he said, "Okay, what we'll do is I'll get my son to write a computer program to process the previous year's exam grades by paper and show you what the results would have been under the new marking system." And eventually, I think I got the project, I got the code working about 2 hours before the meeting was due to happen, having gone along and worked overnight for a couple of nights. Because in those days, of course, you punched your program, you handed it over, you waited, you got it back. And if you were needing as much debugging as I was in those days, that made for quite a slow process. But that machine was absolutely marvelous. The Atlas was the first machine to have virtual memory. It was a very powerful computer by the standards of the day. And rumour had it that when the first Atlas was made in Manchester, when they turned it off, the amount of computing power in the UK halved. I was paid for at college by IBM, and part of the deal was that they would give me 6 weeks' work or so each summer. And in the summer of 1969, I found myself working at the Education Centre in Sudbury Towers in England. And I was working on looking at the feasibility of computer-assisted instruction for some of the courses that IBM taught. And one of my fellow collaborators said, "Oh, would you like to see another language? We've just got something called APL, and it's available for an hour a week on our 360/40. But you're a mathematician. I think you'll like it." And I saw it and I thought, oh my goodness, I would like one of those. But once a week was not enough really to invest much time in learning it. And I kind of forgot about it for a year or two. But that was really the first seed. 1974, by this time I've graduated, I've finished my master's and started doing the neural network stuff. I need to earn some money. I'm working for a company, a little engineering company called Teknotalk. They wrote Fortran for the IBM 1130. The 1130 was mentioned earlier. And APL was available on it, although I didn't even know that that was something I could run on a machine. Years later, incidentally, I heard something interesting about that implementation. Maybe someone in the audience can tell me if it's true or not. I think it was Al Rose that told me, which means it's probably true. The 1130 would execute functions one line at a time in memory, I believe. I believe it actually paged each line in from disk. And that's why it became very important to get lots of code on one line. So that's allegedly where the rot started. Anyway, at this stage, I'd almost forgotten about APL. I was joined at Teknotalk by a guy called Brian Drury, an ex-director of Teknotalk, Phil Gosher, whose name was mentioned yesterday when we were hearing the Dyalog story. Phil was by then working at Atkins, and Atkins had just got into APL. And as you may have inferred from yesterday's story, Phil was quite a wheeler dealer and would never take a direct approach when an indirect approach was possible. So he decided the best way to get one of his people trained by IP Sharp was to persuade my boss to send him along as a student from Teknotalk. It was crazy, actually. I mean, if he'd just gone to IP Sharp and said, "I know we're competitors, but can we have someone on the course?" there wouldn't have been a problem. But Phil couldn't believe that anyone would be that open and straightforward. So he booked a student on the course, and the student went on the course and finished it. And then 2 or 3 days later, suddenly there came a knock on the Teknotalk door, and a guy called Dave Saunders, whom some of you might remember from IP Sharp days, arrived carrying a 2741 and saying, "So here's your free terminal for the free account you get for a week after the course, a month after the course." "Oh, where's Steve Thompson, the guy who'd be trained?" So he's, "Oh, Steve's out with a customer today. But leave the terminal, that'll be fine." And I remembered APL and realized that it would be fun to do something with it. particularly because I'd been landed with the worst job ever. There's a computer called the P350, which is a unit record machine. You can see a photograph of one there. And at that stage, the UK government had just introduced a second rate of VAT, our sales tax. And the customer had an accounting application that couldn't cope with 2 rates of VAT. So the program needed to be fixed. The only problem was he had no source code. Okay. You'll hear, this is something of a recurring theme in my life, but this was the first time I got hit by this. So we had the object version of the code, we had an assembler and machine code manual. What we had to do was disassemble the program and add the VAT capability and then reassemble it by hand. And this sounded to me a bit too much like hard work. So I asked my boss if I could write the disassembler in APL. Version 1 worked a bit, but was looping, and introduced me for the first time to the fact that the computer operator in Toronto could stop a program that had clearly got out of control by bouncing it. And I learned fairly quickly after that that a non-looping solution in APL was probably a better thing to go for. Got that finished, really liked APL, and Teknotalk was stuck with its Fortran roots. That market was in maturity to decline. Brian Drury and I got so excited by APL that we decided to set up a company, 2-man business, working out of our respective homes. And at that stage, the IP Sharp London office was run by a guy called David Booth. Anyone remember David? And David was an engineer by origin and quite a cautious guy, but he thought he'd give us a try, and initially we did some work for him subcontract, and that went well. So he let us work directly for Sharp customers, and for a while things went really, really well. One slight worry, we picked up a rumour that a bunch of the guys that we knew from Atkins were thinking of setting up a software company called Dyalog. And we were a bit apprehensive about this because we knew they were quite good guys. And IP Sharp were quite apprehensive about it too, because of course the Dyalog team were really expert in Xerox APL, and Atkins had the Xerox APL service. And IP Sharp was slightly anxious that there was going to be another company with much more financial backing and more people than we were, who might well push people in the Xerox direction rather than the Sharp APL direction. So we met up for lunch, and I'm still not sure whether it was them or me that raised the idea first, but we both came up with the idea of setting up an APL user group so that we could sneakily take control of the market. And we duly set it up. 12 of us got together in my flat in Finchley. Most of the people were users. And we founded something which in those days was the UK APL user group. And a few years later that morphed into the BAA. So I guess my only real claim to have any right to be here is the BAA, but I still feel the BAA is my baby. Hasn't it grown up well? So, later on in the 1970s, lots of stuff happened. I'm usually fairly good at spotting trends early, but I got it really wrong with the 5100, which I loved and I thought was going to take over the world. We bought 2 machines, which meant that we owned 50% of the UK population of 5100s. The other 2 were also well used. Addict started up. STSC sent over Kevin Weaver. I'm sure a few of you remember Kevin Weaver. Kevin was a guy with a taste for the high life, and he met someone in a casino who was running a software house called Alan de Moraes, ADM, and so STSC really started working closely with ADM in the UK, which saddened us a bit. Doubly so because first bit of scandal coming up, well, second actually, because I guess Phil Gosher is always scandalous. Second bit of scandal. We were paid to write a report for another time-sharing vendor, a company called OLS, who were trying to bring out an APL service. And we said, we're happy to do that for you, but we have written into the contract that you may not publish the results without our consent. And we did the research, and they were about half the price of IPSA. And the next thing we knew, there was a headline in the next week's computing paper saying, Cocking and Drury say OLS half the price of Sharp. And John Bassingthwaite, who'd taken over from David Booth, because, third bit of scandal, okay. David had got fired, sadly, because in the early days of IPSAnet, there were quite a few teething problems. And David was really pretty aggressive to, I guess, to the zoo. And he annoyed a lot of people. And so he'd been replaced by a guy called John Bassingthwaite. And the first thing that happened after John Bassingthwaite took over is he saw this headline saying, Cocking and Drury slam Sharp APL, and surprisingly we didn't get a whole lot of work from him thereafter. Loads of other things as well. This was the beginning of the age of the micro. A company called Micro APL was set up by three guys who had been working at Ronio Vickers. And we guessed from their name that they had plans, but at that stage they were just another APL consulting outfit. STSC decided that ADM weren't such a good deal after all. They set up a London office. Another company called Inner Product started up in London, and Inner Product were, I guess, really the pioneers in the UK of APL on micros. In fact, at one stage, they were selling 3 different implementations of APL on CPM, because DOS and PCs hadn't been thought of. And we always used to claim that Salesforce would be selling each day the version which had crashed least often on the day before, because these were all written by 2 men and a dog, and they were incredibly unreliable. But hey, it was a sign that one day we were going to have a reliable APL that ran on a cheap computer. The other very good thing which happened was that a guy called Jonathan Barman, who had been employed by STSC, joined us. Jonathan is a technically very, very capable APLer, but both he and Michael Bramson, who were the head of STSC in those days, were very strong personalities, and they did not get on. And after a few chats one-on-one with both Michael and Jonathan in various bars, we decided that the solution was to get Jonathan to join us, which he did. And he introduced us to Roy Sykes's whiz-bangs and Bob Smith's working memo on Boolean techniques. And suddenly, our APL as a company took a huge leap upwards, because we were learning from guys who really knew which way was up. So 1980s, because we'd started building a much closer relationship with STSC, we were lucky enough to get early access to Bob Smith's NAS system, and I managed to get an account bounced for the second time, because of course with nested arrays you can burn huge amounts of CPU with even fewer characters than you need in first generation APL. APL2 came out. APL83 in Loughborough was really, I suppose, the first time that the UK made much of an impact in the international market. And we started selling a product called ShareFile, which was an independent implementation of STSC and Sharp APL's file system. And that was our first experience of trying to sell mainframe software. And we hired a couple of sysprogs to help us with that. APL Plus PC came out. The world started changing very rapidly. But because of, and we heard a bit about what happened in STSC's history, they were pulling their horns in a bit and decided that they wanted us to take over the role of APL Plus UK. So we started selling their mainframe product, which led to some quite amusing sessions with customers where I would go in and say, you know that share file system which I sold you last year? Well, here's what you ought to replace that with. And on the whole, they said yes. That was great fun. APL86, I guess, for our market, which was very much the APL, the IBM APL or the STSC APL mainframe market, really peaked in that year, though we didn't realize it. APL86, huge conference, great fun. By that stage, we had 40 employees. Our payroll was about 1.2 million a year, which was quite a lot. Meant that we were paying quite well in the 1980s. And it looked like, you know, the world was our oyster. And it wasn't. 3 things happened that were to cause us tremendous problems. First was that Brian Drury and I split up, very sadly. Biggest mistake, I think, of my business life. But Brian left Cocking and Drury and left quite rightly with a decent payment for the shares which he'd owned in the company. The second thing that happened, and it's kind of hard to imagine how surprising this was at the time. In those days, IBM was very, very wary of software houses. And we got called in, and they showed me the sales figures for their leading product, Information Center 1, which was a combination of ADI and ADRS, and the sales figures had just fallen off the wall. And there are all sorts of things, I'm sure, that contributed to that. But that was, for us, the end of the period of exponential expansion, and it led to a period of exponential decline in sales revenues. The third thing, which I forgot to put on the visual, was that the UK economy was in turmoil. We'd had the miners' strike and all kinds of stuff. And we had Black Friday in '87, and the UK economy tanked. We started studying, I think I've got 5 minutes left, is that right?
20 minutes left.
20 minutes, oh thank God for that. I'll start to speak more slowly then. So the mainframe APL market was really tanking. And although we had started to get involved with Smalltalk, largely because Windows was taking off and Smalltalk was one of the better ways of building GUI-based applications quickly. We saw our main APL consulting revenue falling fast, and I made a very bad business decision, which was to take on an application for an industry we knew nothing about. It was also our first Smalltalk project. It was our first project where we had a team sharing code in a source code management system, and it was the first project where we used a relational database and the first project where we used a network. So, not too many new things to cope with at the same time. And actually the technology wasn't really the problem. The problem was we just didn't know enough about the business. And I probably, given the size of the cost overrun, which I'd estimated at £100,000, and by the time we reached £500,000 spend, they thought was perhaps a bit of a problem. I probably shouldn't name the customer, but I will tell you this, that when Adrian Smith produced the products he showed us yesterday, there were 2 lots. There were the chocolates and there was the other thing. And it's the company that made the other thing that was the customer. So when he produced his golf clubs, a shudder ran down my spine. So that project really went awry. Understandably, they cancelled it. By then, that was providing about 80% of our consulting revenue. Not through choice, but because we had nothing else. And we hung on for about a month after they cancelled the project. But by 1994, the main company closed down, and what was left was the software part of the business, which then became Bloomsbury Software, which did a little APL stuff, quite a lot of stack graphics, but by then was mainly selling Smalltalk. And IBM started a wonderful thing called the Object Technology University. They decided they were going to get all of their bright young kids into objects, and so they ran a 5-week immersion course in Belgium, and they followed that up with a 3-week design course in Belgium, and we trained some hundreds, maybe 1,000 or so students how to develop software, initially in Smalltalk, a bit later in Java, and some other guys taught people how to write in C++. At which point IBM suddenly realized that all the DB2 Kix COBOL developers whom they'd been trying to reskill alongside of the bright young things were now going to be needed to do DB2 Kix and COBOL again because of year 2000. So they all trained them back into the old technology. However, I got involved in that activity, and then in the early 2000s I became WebSphered. The IBM WebSphere range by then had expanded to encompass a huge range of software, and I found myself having a slightly surreal experience of teaching IBM architects how to build solutions using IBM technology, when on almost every course there would be at least one product expert who knew about 1,000 times more about that product than I did, and where a lot of the framework which I was supposed to be teaching was IBM confidential, and I wasn't supposed to see it. But it was fun. And by the end of it, because you always learnt from each product expert, there was a stage when I could bluff my way about just about every one of IBM's WebSphere products, as if I knew something about it. At about the same time, I started getting involved, largely through resuming contact with someone who worked for a company called OTI in the past. Started getting involved in the world of test-driven development. And through that, found myself working with some very bright people, some of the really big names in the TDD world, and a couple of very enjoyable projects. One for BNP Paribas was actually the thing that got me back into APL again. I was asked if I could produce a user configurable reconciliation engine. And basically, when you're doing reconciliations, you've got two tables of data that should, after some transformation, match up. And I don't know if that suggests a language to you, but it certainly did to me. But there was no way that I was going to get APL in there, and we actually built the first version of that in using smart arrays. And they loved it. It worked very well. Weren't quite so sure about the smart arrays bit, though, and eventually I found, to my surprise and dismay, that they'd kept my compiler and front end, but they'd replaced the back end by Microsoft Access. Some people don't know when they're lucky. Another lovely project at EasyNet, where the whole project was very TDD based, and anyone here use SkyTalk for their telephone system? No, okay. Sky, alongside their entertainment business, offer a bundle where you get broadband and telephone calls and stuff. And if you made strange calls like alarm calls or reverse charge calls from Mongolia, the system that builds you is the one that I wrote. And my only claim to pride there is that that ran in production for 18 months without a single defect, which is good going. And then the project from hell, which was the thing that made me decide to stop consulting and get back to more fun stuff. I was still doing a bit of training at that stage. And if you're going to train, you really need to do some practical work in order to stay current. And so I asked my friends if they could find me a nice short, maybe 6-week job just to keep myself current. And one of them phoned me back and said, I've got something which I think you could do pretty well, but I should warn you, it's the project from hell. This guy's a warrior. I thought, he's exaggerating. So he said, of course, if you go along, you'll have to do, because we all did, you'll have to do a pairing test, and you'll have to do a technical interview, and then you'll get to hear about the project. But, it sounds, you want something short, this would be good. So I go along, and the project manager said, no, we're not going to ask you to do a technical interview, and we're not going to ask you to do a pairing test, but I should warn you, she says, it's the project from hell. Now I'm worried. Okay. And then she goes to the door of the office and pulls it shut and says, we've lost the source. I figured that was time to retire. So, I started going back to my childhood, as old folk will do, and started playing around with something called the Arduino, a single board computer you can buy for about £20–25. That's really easy to program, so long as you don't mind programming in C, and makes it very easy to drive things in the real world, sensors and actuators, and I wanted to do robotics. So I built myself a cheap Arduino clone for about £5 and had a lot of fun with that. It's there partly because the Atmel chip on which that is based has about the same amount of memory, but about 2,000 times the processing power of the Pegasus that occupied that first picture, and cost some thousands or tens of thousands of pounds back in 1958. And then a little bit later, a friend of mine pointed me at the Raspberry Pi, and suddenly I had not just a computer that was easy to interface with the outside world, but it had a real operating system, and a little later, of course, it had a real programming language as well. Although there was one other little detour. I discovered in 2014 that somebody had written an emulator for the Ferranti Pegasus, which even looked like the console of the machine. And I could remember the program as I'd wrote it. And I was able to verify that there was a bug and finally work out how it had been fixed. So I claim that from 1958 to 2014, that has to be the longest debugging session in history. So if you're thinking of hiring me for programming, there are two things to bear in mind. One is clearly I'm not a very good programmer, but the other is I'm incredibly tenacious. So 2015, discovered that I could now use Dyalog APL on the Raspberry Pi to do neural network stuff, and I started having a whole lot of fun. And then the most recent thing, that's the code which you'll have seen again if you saw the earlier session on Monday. Most recent thing, the Raspberry Pi Zero sells for $5, about £4. Actually, the way the pound's going, $5 or £5 probably. And the staggering thing to me about that is that this little computer, which is significantly smaller than that, you get a quad WA of about 480 megabytes and enough processing speed that you can run quite a substantial neural network quite fast on one of those. So I figured if we're concerned about making APL accessible, clearly the hardware and the software are not a problem. So I've started work on a book on LeanPub, and it's now about 40% complete. It's been kind of held up while I was getting ready for the conference. But if anyone would like early access to the book for free, instead of paying the exorbitant $2.99, which you'll otherwise have to pay, drop me an email and I'll be happy to send you a link that will get you a free copy. Clearly, I would absolutely love anyone in this audience who'd like to take a look at it and give me a bit of feedback and encouragement. That would be very welcome. I will be blogging about the conference at that blog. If you want to contact me by email, there we are. The last thing to finish up with is to thank Dyalog and the BAA for giving me some help to get here. A huge thank to the Dyalog team for organising what, in my opinion, is the best conference, not just the best APL conference, but the best conference I've ever been to. This really has been fantastic. Thanks also, of course, to Ken for giving us APL, and to all of you for helping keep that flame alight. So here's to the next 50 years. Thank you.